What counts as evidence in moral inquiry? In the previous lecture, we discussed the importance of distinguishing morality from cultural or personal mores. We noted some reasons for thinking that if there is a moral reality, it's the same for all of us and is completely independent from our opinions or God's commands. But we haven't given any reason to think that there is a moral reality, nor have we provided any hints about how we can come to know right from wrong. How one comes to discover what's right and wrong is a different question from how one comes to have opinions about what's right and wrong. Each of us has our own set of moral beliefs. We call these mores, long before we gain any ethical skill. Our parents, our older siblings, our school teachers, our religious leaders, and the wider culture, especially television, contribute mightily to forming our personal mores. Now, if moral facts are objective, as facts about chemistry or physics are, then we shouldn't rely too heavily on the mores we learned from those sources as we age. Why? Because in most circumstances, it would be as silly to trust those sources for moral wisdom as it would be to trust them on matters of chemistry or physics. Our culture, parents, religious leaders, etc., may be right, of course, but they may be wrong too. How can we evaluate the mores they imparted to us? The answer is that we have to conduct our own moral inquiry. Moral inquiry works the same basic way scientific inquiry does. It relies upon the interplay of data and theory. Let's start with data. The data in ethical theory is moral intuition. Now, by moral intuition, philosophers don't mean something like woman's intuition, which is a foreboding about the future. They just mean, or at least I will just mean, an appearance that something is morally right or wrong. So that appearance or seeming that torturing babies for fun is wrong is your moral intuition that such an action is morally wrong. And the appearance or seeming that returning money you borrowed as soon as you can is good is the intuition that returning what you owe promptly is morally good. Sometimes moral intuitions take the form of a pang of conscience. You feel a pang of conscience when you feel you have done something wrong. Sometimes you have a moral intuition when you contemplate a seemingly morally bad action being done by anybody. For example, you don't feel personally bad about torturing a baby for fun. But when you think about it's being done, you feel inside this would be a bad thing for someone to do. Moral intuitions aren't always negative feelings. Imagine somebody stopping to help another pick up her dropped books. This seems like a good thing, in most circumstances at least, and you have a positive feeling about it. Sometimes a moral intuition can be very non-emotional, as when you contemplate a person putting on a blue shirt. Nothing seems wrong about putting on a blue shirt, in normal circumstances at least. So the intuition is that it is okay to put on a blue shirt. There's much debate about whether moral intuitions are feelings or cognitive judgments that go along with the feeling. We don't need to worry about that debate here. Let's talk about the fallibility of moral intuitions. Moral intuitions, which you are free to think of as reports of your conscience, are not always correct. Proof: your intuitions about some things have changed. So both sets of intuitions cannot be correct. On capital punishment, for instance, I've gone from having intuitions that were in favor of capital punishment to against capital punishment, and now I have intuitions in favor of capital punishment again. And I may go back to having intuitions against it one day. I don't know. So they change, and so that's proof that your moral intuitions are not always correct, because it can't be the case that capital punishment is both morally just and morally unjust. Nonetheless, moral intuitions are the starting point in our ethical reasoning. They are analogous to sense data in science. After all, we tend to believe what visual reports tell us. For instance, If it visually seems like there's a lake in the distance, we tend to think there is a lake in the distance. We know, however, that appearances can be deceiving. That lake in the distance can be a mirage. Science, which is ultimately based on our senses, provides us with the means to test our appearances. And sometimes the discovery of sciences are surprising because of the way science shows our senses to be wrong. It sure seems as if we are stable and that the sun rises in the morning and sets at night. But in fact, it's the earth beneath your feet that's rotating. It sure seems as if the two horizontal lines in the below figures have different lengths, but in fact, they are equivalent. This is called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So in ethics, as in science, we use imperfect data to formulate principles. A principle is supposed to be a truth that you can apply to get more truths. For instance, E equals mc squared is a principle of physics. And torturing babies for fun is a moral principle. So we generate principles on the basis of data. Consider the curve that can be drawn based upon a bunch of data points gained from direct measurement of the fluidity of an oil as it is heated. Now, because of small errors in measurement, we tend to think that the curve that we would draw between these points would reflect reality better than the points themselves, right? So we know the relationship between temperature and fluidity for this oil doesn't look like some jagged thing, right, that keeps going with all these little jagged. It would not be a jagged line, right? We know the line must be a more elegant curve than that. Okay. Likewise, all right, even though we doubt the precise correctness of these data points, and some of them especially seem suspect, like maybe one of these two, probably this one seems suspect, this one seems suspect, right? Even though we could suspect data points on the basis of a theory we form, the theory we form is nonetheless justified in the first place because of the data points. Likewise, okay, in ethics, we formulate ethical principles on the basis of our moral intuitions. And when the principles and the intuitive data disagree, we will sometimes side with the principles, even though the principles themselves have authority because of the intuitive data. So for instance, consider the principle don't steal. This principle gets its authority from the many particular cases of stealing that we intuitively think are wrong. But suppose you see some money on a roommate's desk and think, you know, I really need that money to buy a book for class. And Sarah is rich and she won't miss that money. In fact, Sarah is so scatterbrained and disorganized, she won't even notice the money is missing. Perhaps in the moment of desire for her money, you don't have the moral intuition that stealing is wrong. But nonetheless, adherence to the principle stealing is wrong is the right thing to do in this case. I think you'll agree. Our moral intuition is often impaired because we are blinded by self-interest. So principles are important. Another example that's more realistic concerns what you owe to people you hate or disagree with. Suppose you hate your brother and your parents unexpectedly die, leaving you the executor to their will. Their will states that you should split everything, but you know of some money tucked away in the mattress your brother has no clue about. You may not have the intuition that it is wrong to take all that money, but that is because of your self-interest plus your animus towards your brother that's blinding you to what is fair and your duty to your parents' wishes. Okay, let's discuss the fallibility of moral principles. So our conscience is often faulty, our moral intuitions are often wrong, and that's why principles matter a lot. However, our moral principles can be wrong too. For instance, consider the principle don't lie or one shouldn't lie. This principle at first seems quite plausible. But suppose you're in Nazi-occupied Germany during World War II and that you're sheltering some Jewish refugees. You hear a knock at the door and open the door to a Nazi death squad that wants to know if you've seen any Jews. The right thing to do, it seems, is to lie. Although the intuition itself is strong, and this means something, it is also significant that there seem to be good reasons behind the intuition. First, Nazis are an evil group and don't deserve the truth as much as good people do. Second, life is precious and much more good would be done by lying and saving these people than by telling the truth. Second, life is precious and much more good would be done by lying and saving these people than by telling the Nazis the truth and letting the refugees be killed. Third, the refugees have done nothing wrong and don't deserve death. Fourth, you have taken refugees under your protection when you allowed them into your home and thus have taken them on as a responsibility. So the Nazis at the door case seems to be a counterexample, a case that disproves a principle to the don't lie principle. You can probably find more counterexamples to this principle, as well as the don't steal principle. This may be a point of concern to some of you. The 10 Commandments say, "Thou shalt not lie," and "Thou shalt not steal." Does that mean the Bible is wrong? Well, maybe, but we don't need to come to that conclusion based upon what was just said. For there are rules and there are rules. Strictly speaking, it is false that one never should lie or never should steal. But most of the time we use principles that are generally true, barring odd circumstances. For example, it is a principle of good health that one should exercise. But some people, such as those with bad hearts, will die if they exercise. That rule doesn't apply in those circumstances, obviously, nor is it meant to. As we talked about in earlier lectures, sometimes we acknowledge atypical circumstances with the phrase ceteris paribus. As we have seen before, we use the ceteris paribus qualifier to exclude unusual circumstances that could falsify the principle. So it may well be true that ceteris paribus, one should not lie. If the biblical writers meant that, they were correct. Much the same can be said for the commandment against killing. Surely the biblical writers, who were very much in favor of capital punishment, didn't intend an absolute prohibition on killing. So to sum up so far, although our moral principles and our moral intuitions often align, they sometimes diverge. When they diverge, you should go with your intuition if you find good reasons to support it, or if the intuition is very strong, long-lasting, and is activated by a variety of similar cases that don't involve you. This helps distance yourself from the situation and helps eliminate the distorting role of self-interest. That means you will have to revise your moral principle in order to accommodate this new ethical data. If your intuition is weak, intermittent, and seems to apply only to this case or cases involving you, you are probably biased and should stick with the principle and reject the intuition. When your intuition disagrees with your principles, it would be good to mull over the conflict and discuss it with people whose judgments you trust. In fact, it'd be good to talk things over with ethical experts, such as ethicists, whether or not you trust their judgment. After all, if your advisors are only people whom you trust, then since you probably trust them because either they are authorities you grew up around or because they tend to have the same perspective as you do, getting their approval can be a little like getting a rubber stamp on your own perspective. It's good to seek out the opinions of articulate people who don't share your moral perspective on an issue, since these people may bring some consideration to your attention that you've ignored. I often solicit the opinions of people on matters I'm of divided mind about, including people who I fundamentally disagree with on many issues, but who I know are good thinkers in general. This method of working back and forth between moral data or moral intuitions on the one hand and principles on the other side, and considering the rationale of people whose ethical perspectives are different from your own, is called reflective equilibrium. We use our moral intuitions or our moral data okay, represented by this circle, to formulate moral principles. Those moral principles cover lots of cases. So we test those principles by imagining weird cases to see if they give the right intuitive prediction. If not, that's a strike against the moral principle. However, if the moral principle makes a lot of good predictions, a counterintuitive result casts doubt on the intuition. It may be faulty data. The equilibrium you ideally reach is a point where your intuitions, your data, and your principles, your moral theories, agree. Okay, they keep on agreeing. Although you can reconcile your principles and your intuitions by tweaking either as you see necessary, you obviously aren't able to reconcile your principles and intuitions with those of other people in many cases. You will simply disagree, just as many of your advisors will disagree with each other. You should be open-minded and give people who disagree with your moral judgments and principles a hearing, yes. And you should be humble enough to realize that just as your thinking is rudimentary in mathematics, science, and the arts, the same is true in ethics, and you have a lot to learn in that field as well. But after all the listening, conversation, and testing of ideas is done, you ultimately have to follow your conscience. You must do what you think is right, even if that is very much at odds with what those around you urge you to do. But maybe not. Should you really kill your children or murder an abortion provider, even if your best efforts lead you to think this is your moral obligation? Before you break the fundamental mores of the culture you're in, you better give lots of thought to what you're doing. Yes, sometimes lone moral geniuses are right. Many people think Jesus and the Buddha are examples of lone moral geniuses who got things right while everyone around them got things wrong. Sure, maybe. But usually the loners are just crackpots who do evil things for what they mistakenly think are good reasons. I think it's worth going back to an early claim we saw in our discussion of moral relativism. Remember, there was asserted by the moral relativist that, given the widespread disagreement among the cultures of the world, we cannot tell who's right or wrong. Perhaps, however, some cultures should be more confident of their mores than other cultures should be. Continuing the analogy with science, I think it's fair to say that people from scientific cultures should be more confident of their views about the way the world works than people who live in scientifically backward cultures should be in their views about those matters. Likewise, I think there might be something that we could call a morally backward culture. Morally backward cultures aren't backward because of what they believe, but rather because the method of ethical inquiry is squelched there for some reason. Here I have a picture of some Dobu, who a Pacific culture that was sort of ravaged by Ruth Benedict in her Patterns of Culture. I don't know how accurately so. I know there's debate about it, but the picture that Benedict paints of them in Patterns of Culture is very grim indeed. Generally, I think we could say that if a culture, say, scolds children when they question the mores they've been raised with, or teaches people not to trust their moral intuitions and to rely upon authority alone for coming to ethical opinions, or tells people that there are no moral facts and only preferences for or against particular actions, or is too busy with play or work or fighting for survival to think about moral questions, then culture X's widespread moral beliefs should be given less credence than one encouraging the method described in this lecture. The moral opinions of a free-thinking, somewhat leisured, and self-critical culture will be, all other things being equal, probably closer to the truth than those of a poor, hectic, and authoritarian one, although, of course, any culture anywhere is bound to have many false moral opinions. In conclusion, remember, a household is a mini culture. Many of you were raised in ethically backward subcultures. I certainly was. But you can grow out of that. I hope this class helps you to develop a culture in your household and community that is morally advanced, whatever your background.